Hi, I'm Will Schultes, Group Director of Technology here at Spinutech. I want to thank you for taking a few minutes to watch this. I know cookie consent isn't the topic that gets everyone excited to click play, but I also know from working with organizations like yours every day that it's one of the topics that can quietly create the biggest problems if it's not handled right. Today's session is called Cookie Practices for Managing Cookie Consent, Protecting Your Brand, Your Data, and Your Ability to Measure Performance. I chose that subtitle deliberately because in my experience, most organizations think about cookie consent as a legal task, something you check off and move on. But the reality is that consent sits at the intersection of compliance, marketing performance, and customer experience. The decisions you make about consent ripple across your entire digital operation. And that's what I want to talk to you through today. Quick word on who we are for those who may not be familiar. Spinutech is one of the top mid-market digital growth agencies in the U.S. We have over 100 team members who develop and manage end-to-end digital solutions for our clients. And here's the number that matters for today's conversation. We host, manage, and maintain more than 1,000 website domains. That means my team and I deal with cookie consent implementations every single day across industries, across platforms, across regulatory environments. What I'm sharing with you today isn't something I pulled from a white paper. It's what we learned from doing this work at scale and from seeing what happens when it's done well and when it's not. Here's what I want to cover with you today. 6 things. First, why cookie consent has become a business critical issue, not just a compliance task. Second, how consent impacts 3 areas: compliance, trust, and performance. Third, the most common mistakes I see organizations make, and I see a lot of them. Fourth, the key decisions every business needs to make before touching any technology. Fifth, and best practices for implementation and user experience. And sixth, what a future-ready consent strategy looks like. The thread running through all this is something I've come to believe strongly from doing this work. Cookie consent is about making intentional decisions before problems emerge. So let's get into it. I want you to hold 3 things in your head throughout this entire conversation. First, they're the 3 business functions that cookie consent directly impacts. First, regulatory risk and legal exposure. The privacy landscape has changed dramatically, and the enforcement environment has shifted with it. Second, marketing measurement and optimization. Every consent decision has a data consequence. When users decline cookies, your tracking gets limited, your attribution gets less accurate, your audience pool shrinks. That affects how you optimize campaigns and defend budgets. And third, customer trust and brand perception. For many of your visitors, the consent manner is the first interaction they have with your brand. That experience sets a tone before they ever see a product page or read a piece of content. In my experience, organizations that treat consent as a technical checkbox, something IT handles once and forgets, end up creating larger problems for themselves later. The organizations that handle this well approach cookie consent as an operational discipline. They align legal, marketing, analytics, and technology teams around a common strategy. That's the shift I want you to think about today. So why am I bringing this to you now? Because the stakes have changed. Organizations today face expanding state-level privacy regulations. We've gone from GDPR and CCPA to a growing patchwork of state laws, each with their own requirements around consent, disclosure, and user rights. And it's not slowing down. More states are enacting legislation every year. We're also seeing increased enforcement activity. Regulators are no longer just writing rules. They're examining how organizations actually implement consent, and they're taking action when implementations fall short. On top of that, there's a growing volume of demand letters and lawsuits. Privacy-regulated litigation has become a real risk factor, and many of those actions start with technical review of your website. And finally, consumer expectations have shifted. People are more aware of how their data is collected and used. They expect transparency. They notice when consent experiences feel manipulative. I'll put it as directly as I can. The question is no longer whether cookie consent matters. The question is whether your current implementation can withstand scrutiny. Can someone look at your setup and confirm that tracking technologies don't fire before consent is granted? Can you produce a record of what users consented and when? If you're not confident in those answers, the session is for you. So let's shift now from why this matters to what the landscape actually looks like. We're moving from compliance requirements to business imperative. Understanding modern consent starts with understanding that requirements vary. They vary based on user location, business location, and revenue thresholds, industry-specific data collection, and whether you serve international audiences. Here's the reality. What most organizations miss. Many companies unknowingly operate on multiple overlapping privacy frameworks at the same time. You might have California residents visiting your site, which triggers CCPA or CPRA obligations. You might have EU visitors, which trigger GDPR. You might operate in a state that has its own privacy law that applies based on your business location. And if you process sensitive information like health data and financial data, you may have additional industry-specific requirements. The map on this slide shows the current state of privacy legislation across the U.S. You can see states that have enacted legislation, states that have active legislation, states where bills didn't pass in 2025, and states with no bill proposed yet. The trend line is clear. More regulation is coming, not less. Your consent strategy needs to account for the frameworks that apply for you today and the ones that likely will be in the near future. Many privacy-related actions begin with a technical review. Someone, whether it's a regulator, a plaintiff's attorney, or a privacy advocate group, examine your website to see how consent is actually implemented. And what they typically find falls in a few predictive categories. I see those patterns over and over in our audits. Cookies load before consent. This is the most common issue I see. Tracking technologies fire the moment a page loads before the user has made any choice. That's a violation regardless of what your banner says. Implement script blocking. Incomplete script blocking, even when organizations attempt to block the scripts. The blocking is often partial. Some tags slip through. Some cookies still get set. Missing consent records. You need to be able to prove what a user consented to, when they consented, what version of your banner they saw. Many organizations simply can't produce this. Misclassified cookies, marketing cookies labeled as necessary, analytic cookies lumped into functional categories. This undermines the validity of the entire consent flow. Inadequate disclosures, privacy policies that don't match what's actually running on the site. The point I want to take away from the slide is that in many cases, businesses believe they are compliant because the banner exists. They see a pop-up, they assume it's working. But tracking technologies continue firing before consent is granted. The banner creates the appearance of compliance without the substance. The gap is where the risk lives. And it's the first thing I look for when I review a site. Regulators are increasingly focused on how consent is presented, not just whether consent is offered. The concept here is that consent must be freely given. That means the user's choice to accept or decline tracking must be a genuine choice, not a nudged one. We've all seen problematic consent experiences. A large green accept all button paired with a tiny green manage preferences link. Decline options buried behind multiple clicks. Multi-step rejection flow designed to wear you down. Pre-selected consent choices that opt users into default. Language that's technically accurate but practically misleading. These patterns are very dark patterns. Regulators are actively identifying and penalizing them. Accepting the decline should have an equal visual weight. Rejecting tracking should be as easy as accepting it. The language should be plain and honest, and the design should be neutral, not biased through color, size, and placement. I want to be candid here with you. If the consent banner is designed to maximize accept rates rather than present a genuine choice, that's a risk. It may feel like it's helping your marketing, but it's creating compliance exposure that can undo all of the work. I've seen it happen. It's not a position you want to be in. Now let's talk about the concrete business impact. When consent is handled poorly and when users decline tracking, what actually happens to your operation? The first impact area is website functionality. Not every cookie serves the same purpose, and this is where I see a lot of organizations get into trouble. There are four main categories of browser cookies. Necessary cookies to run core site functions, session management, security, login state. Analytic cookies measure behavior and performance. Marketing cookies drive advertising and retargeting. And functional cookies support enhanced experience features like language preferences and save settings. The problem arises when consent implementation doesn't properly categorize cookies. Without proper categorization. Blocking marketing cookies can accidentally block necessary ones. I've seen sessions fail. I've seen logins break. I've seen shopping carts disappear. The user experience degrades, and suddenly you've turned a compliance effort into a revenue problem. The takeaway is that consent strategies should both protect compliance and functionality. You need to know which cookies are essential for the site to work, which ones support measurement, and which ones drive revenue. And finally, which ones are just convenience. Every cookie should have a documented business purpose. If you can't explain why a cookie exists, it shouldn't be there. The second impact area is measurement and revenue visibility. Every consent decision has a data consequence. When users decline analytics and marketing cookies, several things happen. Behavioral tracking becomes limited. You lose visibility in what people are doing on your site. Attribution accuracy declines. You can't connect conversions back to the campaign that drove them. Conversion visibility decreases. You see fewer events in your analytics tools. Audience pools shrink. Your targeting audiences get smaller because you can't add declined users to them. And optimization becomes more difficult because you're working with incomplete data. This is the tension at the heart of the cookie consent that I want you to understand. Privacy and performance must be managed together. You can't optimize consent for compliance alone and ignore the data impact. And you can't optimize for data collection alone and ignore the compliance risk. The organizations that handle this well understand the trade-offs and plan for them. They know that less data is part of the equation, and they build strategies that account for it. And the third impact area is brand trust. Privacy is now part of the customer experience, whether you think of it that way or not. For many of your visitors, consent banner is the first interaction with your brand. Before they read your homepage copy, before they browse your products, before they fill out a form, they see your consent banner. And that experience sends a signal. A clear, respectful, transparent consent flow says, we respect your data and your choices. A manipulative, confusing, or broken consent flow says something else entirely. Trust begins before a visitor ever reaches a product page. The question I ask you to think about, what kind of first impression is your consent experience making? Now, before we talk about tools and implementation, let's talk about strategy. Because the biggest mistakes I see don't come from bad technology. They come from skipping the strategy step entirely. Decision 1 is understanding your exposure. Start with business reality, not technology. Leadership needs to answer a set of questions before anyone touches a consent management platform. Where do we operate? What privacy laws may apply to us? Do we process sensitive information like health data, financial data, or data about children? Do we market to international audiences? What percentage of our revenue originates from regulated markets? Those questions matter because they determine how strict your consent model needs to be. If you're a US-only business with no sensitive data and no international audience, your requirements look different from a company that serves EU users and processes health information. Understanding your exposure informs every other decision. It tells you whether you need explicit opt-in consent, whether you need granular category controls, whether you need consent logging, and how aggressive that script blocking needs to be. My advice here is simple. Don't skip this step. Don't let your IT team or your agency pick a tool, configure it without first answering these questions at the leadership level. I've seen what happens when the step gets skipped, and it always costs more time and money to fix later. Decision number 2 is defining your risk tolerance. Compliance is a business decision, not a legal one. Many organizations I work with choose between 3 approaches. Risk avoidance, meaning you mitigate exposure by limiting or removing cookies, tracking technologies that create compliance obligations. You err on the side of less tracking. This reduces legal risk but may limit your marketing data. Risk acceptance, meaning you continue using tracking technologies while accepting responsibility for the associated compliance risk. You prioritize data collection and accept the exposure that comes with it. Some organizations make this choice intentionally. Others make it accidentally by not making any choice at all. In my experience, the accidental version is far more common. And finally, risk transfer, which means you reduce implementation risk by relying on a trusted consent management platform to automate consent collection, script blocking, and regulatory updates. You're not eliminating risk, but you're shifting the burden of execution to a platform that specializes in it. None of these approaches is inherently right or wrong. What matters is making the decision intentionally. The worst position is the default position, where you haven't consciously chosen any approach, and your implementation reflects a series of ad hoc decisions made by different people at different times. Decision number 3 is determining what is truly essential. This requires auditing every cookie category on your site. For each cookie, ask 4 questions. Is this required for site functionality? Is this support measurement? Is this driving revenue? Or is this just convenience-based? Every cookie should have a documented business purpose. If it doesn't, it should probably be removed. This audit does 2 things. It ensures your consent categories are accurate, which is crucial for compliance, and it reduces unnecessary tracking, which reduces risk and improves site performance. Clear categorization is foundational to everything else. Get this right before you configure any tool. What are organizations that handle this well actually doing? Let me walk you through the emerging industry standard. The organizations I see doing this well are converging on a set of practices that represent the emerging industry standard. These include explicit opt-in models where users must actively choose to accept tracking rather than being opted in by default. Regular performance controls where users can accept or decline specific categories of cookies rather than facing an all or nothing decision. Equal accept and decline options with no design bias, pushing users towards acceptance. Script blocking before consent, ensuring that no non-essential tracking technologies fire until the user has made a choice. Consent logging, maintaining a record of what each user selected and when. Transparent disclosures where privacy policies accurately describe what's running on the site. A regulatory audit and governance, because consent is not a set it and forget it deployment. The trend across the industry is toward greater transparency, not less. Organizations that resist this trend are increasingly finding themselves on the wrong side of regulators and their own customers. Building a future-proof consent program comes down to 4 best practices I recommend every organization I work with. First, use a trusted consent management platform. Not all CMPs are created equal. You need a platform that does real script blocking, not just banner display. One that manages cookie categorization, log consent records, integrates with your tag management system, and stays current with regulatory changes. Platform capability directly impacts your outcome. Second, verify technical implementations. Don't assume it's working. I can't tell you how many times I reviewed a site where the banner looks perfect, but the scripts are still firing. Validate that scripts are actually blocked for consent. Confirm that your consent categories map correctly to your tag firing behavior. Check your data flow and analytics tools and retest every time you make changes to your site or your tagging setup. Ongoing validation prevents silent failures. Third, align legal, marketing, and IT. Legal defines the requirements. Marketing evaluates the data impact, and IT executes the implementation. When these teams aren't aligned, you get trade-offs that create problems later. Alignment upfront prevents those trade-offs. Fourth, maintain accurate privacy disclosures. Your privacy policy must meet reality. Disclose your tracking tools, explain your data collection usage, reference advertisements and retargeting. Make sure your consent language matches your actual behavior. The goal here is not simple compliance. The goal is sustainable operational discipline. Consent should be treated as an ongoing responsibility, not a one-time deployment. Let me spend a minute on the most common implementation mistakes I see, because most issues follow predictive patterns. If you take one thing away from this section, it's that these are preventable. Banners without true script blocking. Many default or CMS-based solutions create the appearance of a control without actually preventing scripts from firing. Visibility alone does not equal compliance. Proper implementation requires conditional script loading and validation to confirm behavior. Misclassified cookies, when cookies are in the wrong category, the entire consent flow is compromised. Users think they're declining marketing cookies, but some are still firing because they're labeled as functional. Misalignment between consent and tagging. Your consent category should directly follow how tags fire in your tag management system. When there's a disconnect, you can either collect data without authorization, or you miss data that you should be collecting. Missing or incomplete consent logs. If you can't produce a record of user consent when asked, you can't prove compliance. And no ongoing validation. The most dangerous failures, in my experience, the silent ones. Cookies that quietly start firing again after a site update. Tags that get added without being mapped to a consent category. Regular testing catches these before they become problems. Consent is not a one-time deployment. I want to be clear about that. It requires ongoing attention. Regulations will continue to evolve. Platforms will update. Your site will change. New tags will be added. Each of these events can break a previously working consent setup. Treat consent as part of a larger system. Your website controls what loads. Your analytics captures behavior. Your marketing platforms act on data. Consent connects all three. When one changes, the others need to be checked. What good looks like is straightforward. The site behaves predictably. Data is consistent and explainable. Teams trust the reporting and risk is understood and managed. That's the outcome I want for every organization I work with. Clarity, control, confidence. Let's wrap up with a few key takeaways. Here's what I want you to walk away with today. Protect your brand. Your consent experience is part of your customer experience. It sends a signal about how you respect user data and user choices. Protect the data. Every consent decision has a data consequence. Understand the trade-offs and plan for them. Less data is part of the equation, but good implementation minimizes unnecessary loss. Protect the business. Regulatory exposure is real and growing. The question is whether your implementation can withstand scrutiny. Make sure of it. The best consent management strategies balance 4 priorities: regulatory preparedness, marketing effectiveness, data quality, and customer trust. These are not competing interests. They're connected. The best organizations manage them as a system. Cookie consent is ultimately about making intentional decisions before problems emerge. The organizations that succeed treat cookie consent as an integrated business process, not a compliance checkbox handed off to legal. They align their teams, they choose their tools carefully, and they verify their implementation. They maintain it over time. That's what I wanted to share with you today. This got you thinking about your own consent implementation. I'd encourage you to take the next step. Whether your current setup needs a full audit, a complete rebuild, or you're starting from scratch, Spinutech can help. My team has implemented management solutions across more than 1,000 domains, and we know what it takes to get this right. The strategy, the technical implementation, and the ongoing governance, all of it. Head to spinutech.com to learn more about the approach consent management. We'll set up a conversation, review your current setup, and help you build a consent program that protects your brand, your business, and your data.